Ladies and gentlemen, this is, according to Callus, this is a Text-It Tuesday, and you may have noticed we had a different video intro than what you're getting on the audio. That is courtesy of the audio gremlins that seem to be plaguing me. In case you're wondering, I was off last night to partake in the Text-It visit by none other than Mr. Daniel Miller, author of the book Text-It, also president of the Texas Nationalist Movement. And why you might be asking would I be doing that? Because we deserve a vote. I'll explain momentarily. I also wish to point out that Mr. Miller is just up the road here in Grayson County, speaking in Howe, and he should probably be wrapping up right about this time. So you missed another opportunity to come learn about Text-It. Here's the thing. Before I go any further, for the doubters out there, Texas v. White, which is the famous court case that we always have thrown in our faces, while that was binding in that specific case, it should be known that SCOTUS basically made stuff up. SCOTUS basically came up with an excuse to justify something that had already happened. Why? Because they were unionists. So, for those of you who are judicial supremacists or national supremacists or federal supremacists or whatever you want to call yourself, the states created the federal government. Each state that joins the union comes in as an equal. That means that even though they weren't there at the time of the creation, they are not subservient to the federal government. In fact, the federal government is supposed to be subservient to the states. So while prior to the Civil War, many times, I say many, more than twice, the northern states threatened secession to gain certain, let's say, concessions from the federal government, particularly with dealing with the sectionalism that was quite rife at that time. They threatened it, and never once did the southern states say, well, you can't leave, that's forbidden. No. They cut a deal. They worked it out. So the Union stayed. It was only when those southern states said, yeah, we had enough of this. We're not going to continue to play along. We're going to go our own way. Did the federal supremacists under Lincoln and some of those Republicans force them by army to rejoin and force them to agree to a number of amendments under duress. Something to consider. Also something to consider when they say that the Civil War was about ending slavery. Consider that slavery stayed legal in northern states that didn't secede for quite some time after the Civil War. Consider also that they didn't really care about the slaves. They were more concerned about the submission of those other states. Setting aside the natural detesting of slavery that I have, it is often glossed over that there were other motivations and other things in play that caused the rift between the states, that caused the War of Northern Aggression, as it's been called down here, the Civil War, or the War of Southern Secession. There's many, many names, but the reality is one nation became two and then was basically forcibly returned to become one. And the consequences we are still paying to this day, whether we want to admit it or not. Unfortunately, those of us who are descendants of the people involved are made to feel guilty for something we had zero control over. In fact, some of us our families weren't even here when that went down. So that's something to consider before you throw negative vibes or cast dispersions or are just rude to people, consider that this is not 150 years ago. We are a considerably different place. We are a considerably different makeup demographically, even ethnically, which those two overlap, of course. There's a lot of other things at play. And I don't think there is anybody that I know that would ever defend the idea that one man can own another. Unless, of course, you're Walter Block, but that's an entirely different story. And if you're interested, you should go read his article on that rather than get mad at me. He wrote a book called Defending the Undefensible, and there was an article in there basically defending voluntary slavery. And you may ask yourself, well, why in the world would somebody voluntarily do that? Well, that's exactly what Walter gets into. Now that I completed my detour off the topic, Texas v. White, the court case was binding in that one specific opinion on that one specific issue, basically said that a state can't choose to leave the Union on its own. It must get the permission of the Congress. Now, I'll ask you, on what basis did they come up with that? On what basis do they ignore the very Constitution that Texas says that they can do what they want? And again, why would they, ignore the entire Declaration of Independence? Why would they do that? That's right, because they were creating a new federal government that became the monstrosity that we now know exists and must control everything that we do. So the only way to escape is to leave. To try and reform the beast within is probably I'll just say it's impossible. It's never going to happen, not in my lifetime. And the means in which that may happen would be extremely unpleasant. And quite frankly, I have no desire to experience that. So the other option is a divorce, a peaceful separation. Yes, there'll be some bitterness. Yes, there'll be some people that are unhappy, displaced, or otherwise have issues going forward. The fact still remains that a country can separate and do it in a peaceful way. Some of you that are my age remember there used to be a country called Czechoslovakia. Before Czechoslovakia was created, there was a country called Slovakia. And then there was the Czechs and part of the Bohemian area of Germany that made up another country, right? I think it was called Bohemia, if I remember correctly, but I might have that name wrong. Please forgive me if I've got that off, since I'm doing this all off the top of my head. They were forced together to create a combined country in the aftermath of World War I, and then reconfirmed that after World War II. Indeed, they were under Russian occupation for a long time as the Soviets put their boot upon them. But when they broke free from the tyranny of a foreign ruler, they came to the conclusion that they really didn't want to be bound together. The Czechs and the Slovaks are really quite two different groups of people, and while they were thrown together, they just didn't choose to stay that way. But you know what? They peacefully separated and created two separate countries that, while maybe by the average American standards are not awesome, imagine the people that are there are quite happy with the outcome. I imagine that they're in a much better situation now that they've been able to put forth their own destiny. So, and just in case you're wondering, there was another country created out of the Sudan. That would be the South Sudan. Then there was a place that used to be called Yugoslavia. Now, unfortunately, that didn't break apart peacefully. Unfortunately, there were some severe problems there. But once the partition took place and some of those ethnic, religious tensions were settled out, there's generally a much more peaceful situation there, particularly if you're in Slovenia, Croatia, the former Yugoslavic Republic of Macedonia, not to be confused with the Macedonia that's in part of Greece, apparently. And, you've got some issues still in Serbia or Bosnia-Herzegovina, and then, of course, Montenegro and this whole business of Kosovo. But I'd say roughly a third of that landmass has kind of figured things out, and they're in a relatively peaceful situation. And honestly, Slovenia, from all that I've seen, came out really good in that situation. Then you can look apart at the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviet Union, when it dissolved, broke off and created a whole bunch of other republics. So you've got the Baltic states, right? You've got Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia. All three of those countries seem quite happy to no longer be under the boot of the Soviet Union. Then you've got the Ukraine, which is formerly the breadbasket of Europe. You've got Belarus. From what I understand, probably not a great place that you'd want to go visit. Probably most inclined to return to a Soviet-style government if they ever really left. And then you could throw in Moldova, right? Again, not a slice of heaven there, but somewhat independent, doing their own thing. And then, of course, there's Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, a whole lot of basically Islamic republics that were within the orbit of the Soviet Union, right? And then here's another one to consider. At one point, India was one great big conglomerate under largely British rule, but they had two major groups within there, right? So you had the predominant religion of the area, which was Hindu, and then you've got your Islamists that were there, and they were heavily weighted into an area which became Pakistan and then Bangladesh. So India separated into three separate countries. So you had Pakistan, India, and then Bangladesh. Now the tensions between Pakistan and India, they fight over Kashmir every now and again. I honestly don't remember what the specific importance of Kashmir is other than both sides want it. But Pakistan is almost entirely Islamic now, and India still has a solid majority of, Hindu, but there's still a sizable minority of Islamists, and they go after each other every now and again. But Pakistan is a separate entity. Bangladesh, which I would not expect that anybody wants to actually live in Bangladesh, but that is also another Muslim majority country that separated somewhat peacefully from India, but they're now their own entity, right? They're separate. They were created because they didn't want to be a part of the larger whole. And if you want to go back a little further, there used to be a place called the Austrian Hungarian Empire. And then Hungary left Austria. Again, another separation, something that came together to form a large, and then they separated out to become their own independent functionaries, right? So, for those of you who don't know, Germany used to be a number of small states. They unified and became one. You can look that up. It's kind of interesting under Bismarck primarily. And then, of course, there was Italy. Italy used to be a bunch of separate states on that whole peninsula, right? And, what's funny is the Normans, which we think of as northern France, were actually quite active in Italy. And they ruled part of it for quite some time. But when Italy unified and became its own kind of nation, it's speculated that Sicily may go its own way at some point, right? They kind of created the Rome or Vatican, if you will, as its own little separate entity. Just kind of like London's a separate entity from the rest of England, but that's a different story. So they told England, or Great Britain if you prefer, well, you can't leave the European Union. Oh, well, we set up rules, but it's challenging. You don't want to leave it. But ultimately, Great Britain decided, yeah, the European Union was fine for a while, but now you guys are trying to make us do what you want us to do and not really listening to us. We're going to go our own way. And they did it. Now, granted, they left the process in there to do it. They made it exceedingly difficult and challenging to pull it off, but they did do it. And quite frankly, kudos to them. Unfortunately, Scotland didn't have the nerve to separate from England proper. I mean, they kind of like their combined countries, I guess. And, for those of you that do recall, Quebec has tried to leave the rest of Canada at least twice. I'm not really sure what benefit that would be to Quebec, and I don't really see there's any monstrous state in Canada. But after they arrested 2 pastors this last month for daring to hold, church services, perhaps somebody could convince me otherwise that Canada's going totalitarian, right? And those are just a couple of examples of countries that were created out of another country or separated or left an empire. In fact, while we're at it, pretty much every country that exists in Africa right now used to be a colony, was quote-unquote granted its independence, and is its own country. There was no law that allowed that to happen, was there? I mean, they let them peacefully go, but let's face it, France and England were in no position to run a continent and do anything other than put some administrative staff there to, quote, help out. So at that point, it was inevitable. It was going to happen. So we're kind of at that same point, right? The United States, even if it took its entire military and put it upon Texas, there's north of 30 million people in just the state of Texas. And I'm going to just play a numbers game here. Let's say 15 million of them are men. Let's say that half of them are between the ages of 18 and 50. So now that's 7.5 million. And let's just say of the 7.5 million, half of them are not capable or unwilling to defend themselves. That's still 3.75 million people in Texas that may choose to take up arms. Do you think the entire U.S. military can stand against that? We couldn't even take over Afghanistan and hold it. Do you really think you're going to hold Texas? Just saying, for those of you that are gung-ho federal supremacists. I don't want that. To be clear, I do not desire that. I want to leave peacefully. I want to remain good friends with the former Americans that were our brethren, but we're going to be Texians at that point. And I bear no ill will to our brethren in Oklahoma, Louisiana, Mexico, Arkansas. Of course, they may, New Mexico won't, but Louisiana, Oklahoma, and Arkansas may choose to join us. Just saying. So, if we were to play this out, and the United States here, 8 years after Biden's in office decides, we can't make this work anymore. We're going to go our own way. What's going to stop it? I know everybody's concerned about China, but really, truly, other than potentially nuking us or putting an EMP up, there's not a country on earth that's going to be able to invade and hold the United States. So that's just silly argument. And the United States has neither time nor inclination, this time or any time in the future, to basically maintain a lock on a single state, much less a number of states that want to just go do something else. They couldn't even stop riots. They would have let Portland burn if those people wouldn't have stopped. So I'm not feeling really worried about that. Again, don't want a war. Don't want to have a, bloody secession. Just let us go. After all, if you're a woman and you're in a relationship with a man that's obviously bigger than you, and he has the will to kill you, he could. The question is, does he have the will? But if you stay there and you keep putting up with his abuse, and he comes home drunk and comes home, altered, one day he may just accidentally hurt you far more than what you can recover from. So what's the smart thing to do? Pack up bags and leave. It's really not that different. Yeah, it's kind of a silly analogy, or maybe it's too simple, but is it really? Are any of the states treated in a proper way? Are any of the states shown the deference that they deserve? The feds think that they run everything and everybody, and that's clearly not the way we set up our government. Maybe we just need to remind them of that. Maybe if some of the states just say, yeah, we're not going to do this anymore. Now, I can think of a couple of things stopping short of Texit that might be useful, might be helpful. Actually enforcing the 10th Amendment. Actually just disregarding federal rules that they have no authority to come up with, which I guess is still exercising the 10th Amendment. Maybe reminding them there's something called the 9th Amendment. Or maybe forcing them to actually observe the rest of the Bill of Rights when they make their stupid federal laws that don't comply with that. And what's particularly loathsome is the bureaucrats that create rules and, let's call it minutia of law that supposedly is just as binding as law and has much authority as law, but was never passed through Congress. It never actually was a law. Yet they have zero compunction about making you comply. Sometimes at the threat of death or violence at the point of a gun. Sometimes they just threaten to take all your stuff and bankrupt you. In either way, you would be complying under duress. Does that sound like a world you want to live in? Does that sound like a country you want to live in? Does that sound like we should continue to put up with this? I think not. Now, my goal is not to convince you that I'm right, or that Daniel Miller's right for that matter. My goal is to convince you of two things. One, we have the remedy for what ails us in the state of Texas. Two, we just need to exercise it. And here's something to think about. According to Daniel Miller and what's in his book, the last poll that was actually taken on this issue, and I want to say it was several years back, I don't think it's changed significantly. But of those that self-identified as Republicans, 55% were in favor of Texit. Of those that declared themselves, or self-identified, for those of you that prefer that terminology, as independents, 50% of them favored Texit. Now, the interesting thing is, Democrats, self-identified Democrats, 35% of them are in favor of Texit. Those are pretty good, solid odds that if we were to actually have a referendum, Texit would pass. Now, I know what you're saying, but what about this? What about that? What about this? You know what? That's Daniel Miller's gig. I'm not going to even try and answer all those questions. They've spent the better part of 25 years getting all the answers to that. They spent the better part of 25 years researching all the ifs and the whats and the wherefores. Go read his book, call them up, listen to his Ask Me Anything broadcasts. Not my job. What I am here to tell you is when you have elected officials that ignore and continue to disregard what is clearly the will of a good chunk of people in the state of Texas, and they say there's no interest, and this is silly. They're really telling you is you don't matter. What they're really telling you is they don't care what you think. What they're really telling you is they don't want to do the job that you sent them to do. Now, interestingly enough, we recounted all of the state reps and state senators that are in Collin County. And guess what? Only 2 of them hinted that they might support putting this referendum out. Not whether or not they support Texas, but just even hinted at supporting you getting the right to vote and to exercise your voice and your position on the matter. Only 2, and they were lukewarm at that. Now, I understand. If you're a Texas senator or a Texas representative, you're special. And you want to keep your boss happy. You know, the guy that you answer to down in Austin. But here's the thing. You don't actually work for them. You work for us. And the problem is as much as I remind everybody that these people work for us, when it comes time to primary them, when it comes time to challenge them nobody shows up. Nobody wants to put in the work and the effort to do something about it. So, say you don't like your state rep. Well, you can stay home and not vote for them, but unless a good chunk of people do that have an R after their name, your state rep, if he is an R in a R district, is going to probably still win re-election. And I know, hey, believe it or not, there are Ds that at least want to give the vote to the people. Now, they're not super public about it, but they exist, right? They want to do that. And if you live in a D district and your guy or gal doesn't want to give you that, right? You need to remind them you work for us. You need to go show up at their meetings and tell them this is what you want. The interesting thing is, once we eliminate the boot of the federal government upon us, things are going to change up quite a bit. And I suspect that there may be even a little bifurcation within the state of Texas, right? So your major cities are blue forces. And most of us outside of those cities are like, that's Austin. They want to do their thing. That's Dallas. They're just Dallas. And if that's the way we roll, and you all get your spot and we get ours, I think everybody would be happy with that. The problem is, all too often, people don't want to let other people do what they want to do. And this is the core of the fail of the people that are supposed to be letting us exercise our rights in this vote for Texas. Those same people run the cities. Those same people are identified by different groups of people, either as Yankees or as Karens or busybodies or just pain in the butts. If we can't overcome that on both sides of the aisle, if we can't overcome that, we're not going to get to say our piece. I am perfectly at peace. We twist enough arms, and on 2024, on the primary ballot, there is a referendum on the Republican primary ballot. Would you support a call for Texas? If by some way we can't get a vast majority or a small majority out of the Republican primary voters, it's okay. So y'all were right. Done. End of story. Texas dead. We're going to all be good Americans going forward. Okay. But I think, and then Daniel Miller actually references, I think that they know that that's not what would happen. I think that they know that if they were to put a referendum on the ballot, in the general ballot, there would be a significant majority of people would want to exercise a Texas. They would want to see how we can make this happen. And I think that really scares them. Now, if you're a state rep or a state senator, a good number of them, they see it as their career, right? Or as a stepping stone to a bigger career where they get to go to D.C., so they leave the Austin swamp to go to the D.C. swamp and play with the big boys. Okay, I get that. And if we became our own country, they might not be able to do that. They might become less important. Their egos might take a hit. That's terrible. But do you really think that we're going to fix all of our issues and all of our problems by kicking D.C. to the curb? Well, obviously the answer is no. Obviously we're still going to have to keep working. Obviously we're still going to have to do the hard work of protecting liberty. But if we're successful, we take one of the boots off our necks. We take one of the knees off our back. We take one of the restraints off our wrists. And we can fight better. We can fight more effectively. And we can regain our lost liberty. We can force the people in Austin to respect the Texians and the Tejanos that are here, that by right should be running their own state, by the Texas state constitution, are the power by which things are supposed to happen, are the authority, the ultimate authority of our Texas state government. And they conveniently forget about that. They conveniently don't follow the Constitution. These same guys and ladies that are stating an oath that they will protect the Constitution don't even know what it says. And that, for me, is very, very bothersome. It's, for one thing, to not know the entirety of the Constitution, but to not even have a clue, not even to have read it, not even to understand the implications that we are an independent state that reserves the right to reform or abolish any form of government that becomes tyrannical. Now, I'm sorry, folks. That's tough. That's really tough. So you're scared. Now, if you're a Democrat and you're thinking to yourself, well, I don't want a bunch of evil Republicans running our state. Yeah, okay, I understand your fear. But would you rather deal with a bunch of people in Texas that you actually have a pretty good chance of being able to communicate with and see with on a more likely basis than the people in D.C.? Same thing, if you're an independent, do you think you might have a little more say in matters if we were to go independent? I'm just saying. And if you're a Republican, rather than listen to the Pied Pipers we've sent down to Austin, consider that for now, we are the majority party in the state. For now, we have to exercise our authority and remind these people exactly who they are working for, and that is us. We want to be able to speak on this issue. They need to provide the means. If not, we can find somebody else who will. If not, why listen to them anymore? Those people need to be retired. Well, I hope this was helpful. I hope this was worth your 30 minutes or whatever. As they say, you cannot care about politics, but politics cares about you. You can wish it away, but until you do the work, it's going nowhere. And that, my friends, is this episode of According to Callus. I will see you on the other side.